Good afternoon and welcome to this special America First Policy Institute webinar on the voice of Iranian women, a look at the Amini protests in Iran. I'm Fred Fleitz. I'm Vice Chair of AFPI Center for American Security, and we have some special guests here and experts who are going to talk about the 40 days of protests we've seen in Iran since an Iranian woman, Mahsa Amini, was brutally killed after Iranian morality police beat her to death for not properly wearing a headscarf. These are the worst protests in Iran since 2009 after a fraudulent presidential election. And there's many questions about what this will mean. Will they last? What are they going to do for the future of the Iranian government? And how supportive will uh, nations be to isolate Iran for this violence? So I'm joined today by my colleague, Jacob Olador. He is director of API Center for American Security, and he's director of our new Middle East Peace Project. Jacob served as a special advisor in the office of Vice President Mike Pence, and he was a senior policy advisor to two U.S. senators. And our two special guests are Eli Kahanim. She was the Trump administration's deputy special envoy to monitor and combat anti Semitism. She also was the State Department's first Iranian born envoy. Ellie arrived as a child refugee in the United States after her family fled Iran due to escalating anti Semitism during the 1979 revolution. Previously, she was senior vice president and special correspondent for the Jewish Broadcasting Service. Ellie, welcome.
Thank
And
you.
also joining us is Victoria Coates. Victoria is currently a senior research fellow for international affairs and national security with the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. She served during the Trump administration as deputy assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor for Middle Eastern and North African affairs. She also was an advisor to the Secretary of Energy. Victoria, welcome. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have a discussion by Ellie, Victoria, and Jacob. During this presentation, you can ask questions through the YouTube or Facebook portal, and we'll answer them later. But Ellie, I'd like to start with you on the status of the protests in Iran.
Fred, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank you. I want to thank Jacob and Brooke Rollins for inviting me on. And I want to thank the America First Policy Institute for hosting this conversation today. I think it shows that America First understands the significance of the moment that we're in right now, which is that we are 6 weeks into what I believe started out as a protest movement has now become a revolution in Iran. Now, I want to start, Fred, I believe you asked us to prepare some remarks. So I want to start by saying that there are some in the Biden administration who will have us believe that what the Iranian people are calling for is merely reforms of their government. There are also others, namely folks who many believe have been an echo chamber for the Islamic Republic of Iran regime itself, people affiliated with institutions like NIAC and the Quincy Institute, who would have us believe that the people in Iran are demonstrating against U.S. sanctions. So I think, first of all, it's very important for us to listen to the voice of Iranians. And the subject of our conversation today is Voices from Iran. What the Iranian people have been chanting now on the streets for 6 weeks is words like azadi, which means freedom. They're chanting words like death to Khamenei or death to the dictator, which is a call for regime change. So I think that first and foremost, it's really important for us to set the record straight about what it is that the people of Iran are demanding right now. And again, they are going out in the streets now, 6 weeks of demonstrations in every province in the country, over 80 cities. And what we're seeing them call for is regime change. So, Fred, right now, the Iranian people are bringing about a revolution. What's also extraordinary about this revolution is two factors. Number one is that it's a women's-led movement. And I believe it's the first women's-led revolution in history. Now, there's a good reason for that. Since 1978, when the Ayatollah Khomeini grabbed power following the 1978-79 revolution in Iran, what we've seen is a regime which has conducted the most vile human rights abuses against all Iranians, average Iranians. But in particular, they have also instituted a system of gender apartheid against the women and girls of Iran. So, as we saw in the murder and killing of Mahsa Amini, which was the spark for this revolution, women have no agency even over their own bodies. Mahsa Amini was an innocent Kurdish girl who came to Tehran with her family to visit her uncle. And what happened was that the so-called morality police grabbed her. They arrested for so-called improper hijab, and they murdered her. They murdered this innocent girl who came from, kind of like from the outskirts of Tehran to the big city. Now, why I believe this was a tipping point is that Mahsa Amini was not the first girl who was murdered at the hands of the regime's security forces, and unfortunately, she was not the last. So what we know is that the system of gender apartheid has now created such a tsunami of anger against the regime that we're seeing not only the women and the girls of Iran rise up to revolt, but we're seeing their husbands, fathers, brothers. The men of the country are also side by side, and truly it's a revolution. So one of the unique factors is the fact that this is a women's-led movement, and I believe it's again sparked by the fact that they've lived under a gender apartheid system for now over 40 years. What else is unique in this moment right now is the fact that we're seeing incredible unity among the Iranian people. Now, it's important to understand that Iran is very ethnically diverse country. You've got Persians, but then there's also the Baloch, there's the Kurds, and Mahsa Amini was Kurdish Iranian. You have even some people of Turkish descent in the country. So it's a very ethnically diverse country. And the regime has always tried to divide the Iranian people. And I'm sorry, let me not forget the Ahvazis. So the regime has always tried to divide the Iranian people along ethnic lines, along religious lines, and along gender lines. And what we're seeing right now is complete unity among the Iranian people. The Iranian people are understanding that this regime has been oppressing all of them, and they're united in this cause to overthrow the regime. What I also would tell you is also incredibly important about this moment in this revolution is that there are many factors that we're seeing that we haven't seen in the previous protest movements, Fred, that you alluded to earlier. So we're seeing something like a national anthem, the song Baraye, which has been played over and over again all across Iran as this revolution is unfolding. But just today in the diaspora, we saw a song that was composed and sang by 5 very famous Iranian women singers, and one of them is an actress. And the song says, "Iran will soon be Iran again. Iran will be Iran again." And for those of us who live outside of Iran, those of us who are living in the diaspora, this for us is also a national anthem, and it brings the Iranian people inside Iran and in the diaspora together again. I also want to mention the international support that we've seen for the revolution is unprecedented. Just this Saturday in Berlin, we saw 80,000 people come out to protest against the regime. And very nicely and very fortunately, soon after, we saw the German Foreign Ministry put out a statement that Germany will no longer be conducting business as usual with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so that is the kind of events that I think the Iranian people, that is the kind of support that the Iranian people are looking for from the West, exactly what the German government did. And they sent out a series of steps that they are taking against the Islamic Republic to really, again, make it clear that this is not a business as usual moment. And Fred, I believe that it's time for the Biden administration as well to understand that this is not a business as usual moment for the United States. The moment really is now for Joe Biden to take some very serious steps to make the Islamic Republic of Iran a pariah state on the international scene, which it really behooves the United States to do that at this point. The notion that after 6 weeks of people putting their lives on the line in Iran, that somehow the United States is just waiting for this to end so that they could go back to the Vienna talks and the rest of their failed Iran policy it's ludicrous, and it's really insulting to the Iranian people, and ultimately it would be a stain on the record of the United States of America.
Thank you, Ellie. Victoria Coates, can we hear your take? Victoria, your mic is not on. Well, we'll work on that. Folks, we're using a new webinar interface. That's why we're a little late today. So there's a few bugs in the system. Victoria, you work on that, and I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jacob Oladort, and we'll come back to you in a moment.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Fred, first of all, for convening this important conversation, and to our guests today, to Ellie and to Victoria, for not only your work currently and writing and speaking on this, but your tremendous service on behalf of the American people in the Trump administration towards the Middle East and on Iran in particular. And so, and yours as well, Fred, of course. And so, and welcome to our viewers too. But I think just to be very brief, and I want to turn it to Victoria, I'm more interested in what she has to say than my own thoughts. But I think the way Ellie characterized it is so eloquently is exactly right. And I think just some numbers to put out there. I mean, the Iranian regime has killed, by one estimate, 252 people. By one count, 90% of those actually are Baluchi. 35 of those are children, and 13,300 at least have been arrested during the course of these protests. And as Ellie said, these are unprecedented in scale and demographic, ethnic, economic representation, and generational representation as well. The only, and I don't want to steal Victoria's thunder on this, but my only variation to add is also the U.S. policy response, exactly as Ellie said. I would point our viewers to the U.S. envoy to Iran, Rob Malley's interview, I think just yesterday with France 24, with an excellent interviewer, and his responses. And I think that should tell you as much as you need to know about where U.S. policy is on Iran. Not once did he mention policy change. When asked directly the question of whether the Vienna talks that he's leading are dead or still ongoing, he said they're not on the agenda, very coyly averting the issue. He also misrepresented, of course, the whole purpose of the protests, as Ellie described. It's not that the Iranian people want their regime to respect their human rights. It's that they want regime change, period. They are sick and tired of the regime itself. So I think there is a lot still to be expected and needed of this administration. I also think, on Ellie's point, it is a big moment as well that our European allies have taken steps. I mean, the sanctions the EU imposed in response to human rights, let's call them what they are. They are symbolic, but they are the first since 2013. That's important, and we need to be pushing our allies to do more. Germany is a good example of that, of downgrading bilateral dialogue and relations with Iran. That kind of isolation is exactly what the Iranian people, in my view, need at this moment. I don't know if Victoria's audio is on, but I will turn it over to her. But yeah, looking forward to rejoining the discussion.
Looks like we still have a technical problem. My colleague Adam is working on resolving that. So we will get to her in a moment. But in the meantime, I have a question I want to ask both of you, and hopefully Victoria in a moment when Adam could get Victoria logged on. How are these demonstrations different? You know, we saw massive demonstrations in 2009, and many thought the government was going to be overthrown. And it wasn't, because the IRGC and the besieged came in and brutally suppressed the people. That has not happened yet. So I'm wondering, from the two of you, what is your view on where these protests are going, and how much of a threat are they really to the continuance of this brutal regime?
I'm happy to answer that first, Fred. What I would tell you has been extraordinary for me to watch, and why I'm convinced that the genie is out of the bottle when it comes to this revolution, meaning that the regime is just not going to be able to quash what's happening in Iran, is the fact that we're seeing 15 and 16-year-old kids, girls specifically, ripping their hijabs off their heads and chanting "death to the dictator." So once you've lost the children, when you've lost the 15-year-olds, then I don't see how the regime is going to be able to turn this back. How are they going to try to reoppress these kids after these kids have gone out and fought for their own freedom? And also, Fred, I want to at this moment just mention that in tweeting out the invitation for today, I mentioned that I was dedicating my remarks to the memory of Mika Shakarami, who was a 16-year-old girl who was out there protesting, who did rip the hijab off of her head, and tragically, about 8 days later, her body was dumped for her family. They had no idea where she was for 8 days. And so this is the kind of bravery and courage. These 16-year-old girls like Nika, they know that when they step out of the house, they know that they could not come home. And yet they are still pouring out in the streets. And yet it's 6 weeks later and people are still out there taking their lives at risk every time they go out there to join these demonstrations. So, Fred, I am convinced that this time is different from the past.
So, Jacob, what do you think?
Well, I first want to turn to Victoria and see if she's ready.
You please answer. I'll take care of that.
Okay,
we're still working on it.
Sure. Well, I think Ellie said it very eloquently. I think one of the most moving videos that I've seen, I mean, following Twitter and my friends who were closely watching it, is actually a very banal sight to our American eyes. But I think if you think about it in the Iranian context, is so tremendously powerful, is women, girls, walking through streets of Iran without head coverings, just, tapping one another and tapping people they go by, and just, it's such a powerful statement of their bravery. And of course, the 41 million women and girls represented by that demographic. And so I think first and foremost, as Ellie said at the top, the fact that this is probably the first, certainly in Iran, to my mind, protest, maybe even revolution led by women is remarkable in its own. There is another dimension we haven't talked about, and that is the regime itself, which in my view is going through a transition really since the Trump administration killed Qasem Soleimani in 2020, and obviously the succession after Khamenei and reports of his ailing health, and the fact that we have the Abraham Accords in the region. This is a new Middle East and a regime struggling to find its footing. And you even saw that with Raisi's early statements saying that we have openness of speech at the very early days of the protests. So, the regime has proven resilient in the past. It's still too early to tell, but I think the Iranian people too are uniquely brave and uniquely resilient in their fight. And so this will be a very, very important moment to watch, and to watch specifically for American leadership to act the right way.
And another issue that is really getting a lot of attention in the United States right now is how Iran is isolating itself further by collaborating with the Russians in Ukraine, and not just by providing drones to Ukraine, and not just by supposedly providing technical support to help the Russians operate weapons in Ukraine, but there are new reports that Russia is assisting Iran to advise it on how to put down the protests that are ongoing throughout the country. Ellie, I don't know if you've heard reports about that, but I'm wondering, how does this change this conflict and the way the world deals with it?
Fred, it's a very worrying development. I think many of us have been tracking what and I believe you and others have termed as the new axis of evil, which is the China, Russia, Iran alliance, which at its core seeks to challenge the United States and the US led world order. So, what we're seeing right now with, like you said, the Iranian drones, the Iranian boots on the ground in Crimea, training in the use of their drone technology. All of this kind of points towards that axis. At the same time, though, I'm convinced that that no outside force can save the Iranian regime. The notion that they're going to import Russians into Iran to put down the Iranian people. We've also seen reports that the regime is importing its Hezbollah and Iraqi militias into Iran, also to kill Iranians. And the Iranian people are very proud people. Then they are not going to stand by as Iranians and let Arabs or Russians come in and murder them on the streets. So I think that ultimately, if that is the tack that this regime is going to take, it's going to backfire on them. It's going to inspire an incredible nationalism. I mean, we've seen this unity among the Iranian people right now. But again, if they resort to importing others of other countries to come and kill Iranians, it's just going to backfire on them.
So Iran is relying, I guess, on Russia as the only state that can stand by it. But are there other nations that Iran could rely on or may side with it on these protests? And I guess I'm thinking China, but who is Iran relying on right now, and what could be done to isolate them more in response to these protests?
Please.
Jacob, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No. Well, I was just going to pick up from where you left off, Ellie. The short answer is I think we are the ones. I mean, the Biden administration are the ones that are propping up the Iranian regime right now. I mean, and I go back to Rob Malley's interview because he talks about the transfer of Iranian drone technology to Russia. I don't recall if he mentions Russians training Iranians in the streets, but his response is we will sanction those responsible and kind of piecemeal symbolic sanctions. What he doesn't address, and this is reflected in the national security strategy that this administration released earlier this month, is recognizing Iran for who it is and adopting the Trump administration's policy toward it as an adversary and as the lead world state sponsor of terrorism. The word terrorism appears in that strategy, but never, in my reading, in the context of Iran, which is noteworthy. I mean, they talk about Iran's sponsorship of proxies, violations of human rights, but never do they talk about Iran as the world's lead state sponsor of terrorism. That is noteworthy. And I think, so the short answer really is that it is our responsibility, American leadership here, to really to lead that policy change that recognizes Iran's tentacles in different parts of the world, its connections, dependency on Russia and China, although probably Russia provides that military assistance, and only that can put an end to this.
Fred, I just want to echo what Jacob just said, because I think it's kind of a mind-boggling statement, but Jacob is so exactly right. The United States under the Biden administration is actually propping up the Islamic Republic of Iran regime. And again, I believe this is something that will be a stain on our history unless, Biden changes course in the last 2 years of his time in office. So the steps that the Biden administration can be taking, and I imagine that Victoria would address some of this because she is truly an expert. But in the meantime, I'll just venture forward with it. We need to see, like Jacob said, first of all, the acknowledgement of the reality that the Islamic Republic of Iran is an enemy and adversary of the United States of America. And from there, we need to see that the announcement that they are walking away from the Vienna talks to re-enter the failed JCPOA Iran deal. Now, the reason why this is so critical is because you need to signal to the world that there will be no further talking to the Islamic Republic of Iran. There's no further negotiations. There's nothing to talk about. This regime is illegitimate. And how do we know it's illegitimate? Well, its people are protesting on the streets, taking bullets to the head for 6 weeks, telling the world that this government does not represent us, right? They have no legitimacy at home. So there's no one for the Biden administration to be talking to. Other steps that I would like them to take is enforce the Trump administration sanctions that are already on the books. We know they're not enforcing sanctions. And then, of course, there is the option to add additional sanctions to really, really corner the Islamic Republic regime. I also think it's high time for the United Nations Human Rights Commission to be putting together an emergency session. And this is something that the Iranian Crown Prince Pahlavi has called for. He has contacted Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, and he's called for an investigation into the atrocities that are being committed against the Iranian people right now. Oh, I see Victoria's back.
Well, is our Deputy National Security Advisor guest? Can you hear us? I'm sorry, but we still can't hear you, Victoria. Well, we're going to take another shot at getting this working before the hour is out. Our great technicians are working on it, but I have another question I want to ask in the meantime, and both Jacob and Ellie were touching on it, and that concerns the Biden administration to strike a new nuclear deal with Iran. And I think those of you watching this know that this agreement will be even worse than the Obama administration's agreement. It may give Iran $1 trillion in sanctions relief by 2030. And we all know where that relief will go. We'll see what happened with the Obama deal. It will go to terrorism, Iran's nuclear program. After the Obama deal was signed, Iran sent troops into Syria. And it just seems that nothing can stop the Biden administration pushing forward on this agreement. But it could be that the Iranians have gone too far given the protests in Iran right now and assisting the Russian regime. I think maybe they've gone too far, but I'd like to hear the opinion of the other panelists on this. Ellie, let's start with you.
Fred, again, the notion that the Biden administration is somehow going to sit across the table with the Islamic Republic of Iran, how is that exactly going to play out? Right now they're murdering Iranians on the street, right? They're killing 16-year-old girls because they didn't sing the national anthem. They're killing 15-year-old girls because they're not wearing a proper hijab. So there's, it's like a bloodbath going on in Iran against the civilians, against the citizens, against the people. So how does Joe Biden exactly maneuver this? Is the idea that the Biden administration has that they're going to just, wait it out? Are they rooting for the regime? Let's hope the regime gets this, this nuisance under control so we can go back into the Iran deal. It makes no sense, and honestly, it's un-American. It's against every value that the United States holds dear. Our values of freedom, liberty, democracy, human rights, religious freedom, you name it. And so I just can't imagine how Biden thinks he would get away with trying to get back into the Vienna talks. And the reality is the reason why the talks were on hiatus before the protest starts, because the polling that they've done, even Democrats don't support the Biden administration's reentry into the failed deal. So, Joe Biden doesn't have support for it, even in his own party. I have a really hard time believing that they could try to re-enter. But more importantly is the statement that they're not making, and they should be making right now. The statement that the Biden administration must be making right now is that we won't talk to this regime. This regime is illegitimate. And I believe that all those who are watching today, if you call your members of Congress and you get your voices heard, it's important because through Congress, we can get the message to the White House.
Jacob?
Absolutely. No, I think Ellie put it very eloquently and accurately. I think that's exactly right. I think the Biden administration has put itself into a very uncomfortable box. Of course, if the protests were not happening, I mean, I think their dream and wish would be for this nuclear deal, which you so well document in your analysis, Fred, would be so much more dangerous and catastrophic than the Obama one. That would be their dream, is to have that come together. It's worth our viewers remembering that this is the same team that ignored the 2009 protests, and all in order to pave the way for a deal for the JCPOA, 1.0 to materialize. And so, right now, my personal sense is that it is politically and optically just so inconvenient for the Biden administration to openly admit that they are in talks with the Iranian, or indirect talks with the Iranians, especially when you look at Europe and their efforts to isolate Russia, in Ukraine right now, and Europeans now taking actions with respect to Iran. There is no way and no pathway for the Biden administration to really openly pursue this kind of publicly. But I think their every desire is to get this deal nonetheless. And I think it's a saving grace that that's not materializing yet. But yeah, it's.
Well, I heard what the two of you had to say on this, and I have to say I don't agree. At the end of August, it looked like there was going to be an agreement, and it was going to be a terrible agreement. And one of the main sticking points was that Iran was refusing to allow inspections of several sites where uranium traces had been found that indicated covert nuclear weapons work. It looks like they had found a way to put that under the rug. And there were other demands that were being made. And it appeared that Iran pushed the administration too far. That's why the talks stalled. But I think the talks actually stalled because of the midterm election. And my fear is that no matter how the election comes out, this administration will resume its obsession with getting a nuclear deal, thinking that by November 2024, they strike a deal late this year or early next year, the American people won't remember it. I'm very worried because, in my view, Maley has no intention of giving this up. His recent statements suggest that this agreement isn't on the table right now, but it isn't dead. But in my view, there are not negotiations right now, only because it's politically convenient at this moment. I think this terrible deal, this terrible sellout that will make the oppression in Iran worse, still could be coming. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you folks think?
Fred, the polling I was referring to was in terms of the midterms. So I agree with you. The reason why they put the talks on hiatus, beyond the fact that maybe the regime pushed the Biden administration and their demands too far, but that's just how they do this, is because the polling showed that this would play so badly in the midterms for Democrats. So I agree with you that after the midterm elections are behind us, the Biden administration may see that as a good moment to try to, again, publicly restart the talks. But I also want to say, and something that we haven't talked about that's going on the ground in Iran is, besides the ongoing protests, which we don't see any energy seeping out of the protests. In fact, yesterday was the 40th day of the murder of Mahsa Amini, and in the Muslim tradition, the 40th day is a ritual day of mourning. And today was the 40th day of Nikah Shakarami. And in the protests today, the regime forces killed another individual. And so there is a possibility that we're going to continue to see these rituals of the 40th day and continue to see these protests growing and growing. At the same time, what we have seen that we haven't spoken about yet is strikes. Now, there have been a number of sectors in Iran that have, the workers have gone on strike. We've seen it in the very important oil refinery workers, which is directly funds the regime's pockets, to a number of different sectors, all the way through sugarcane factory workers, to teachers who called a strike for 2 days after something like 23, but Jacob, you said 30, and I'm sure it's correct. Children have been killed by regime forces at this point.
35.
So 35. And my heart breaks at the thought of a child, that they're killing children in Iran. that's the nature of this regime. And so the strikes, I think, also have an important part to play. And there have been strikes in the bazaar in Tehran as well. Now, if our audience remembers the events that happened in the 1978-79 revolution, when the king, the Shah, was overthrown, the strikes played a very important role in that series of events. And so there are many people who are also tracking the strikes, and there are many who are encouraging Iranians to strike. And ultimately, if the strikes pick up pace, it could also be a way for individuals in the West to help. You know, we could try to help financially so that people can maintain their strikes and not go to work. In the case of the oil refinery workers, apparently the regime was actually arresting strikers, demanding bail, releasing one set of workers, and then arresting a new set of workers. So you know, the regime understands how serious the strikes are. And so, going back, Fred, to your question about the Biden administration attempting to re-enter the deal after the midterms, if we see continued demonstrations by the Iranian people, if we continue to see the regime carry out their brutal tactics, if we see growing strike movement, again, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Biden administration to somehow convince the American people that they have American people's vote for them to try to re-enter this deal. I think they're going to have a tough time selling that to the American people.
I think you're right, and I want to go to Jacob in a minute, but I want to note on that particular observation that when the nuclear deal was voted on in September of 2015, the majority of the American people opposed it, and a majority of Congress voted against it. Just not enough voted against it to disapprove the agreement. I'm going to check with Victoria quickly to see if she's on. We can hear her now.
Can you hear me?
Oh, all right. We've all been waiting to hear your brilliance on this issue. And just to reiterate, Victoria Coates was a deputy national security advisor in the Trump administration. She was a special advisor to the Secretary of Energy. She's on Fox News all the time. She's now a senior fellow with the Heritage Foundation. And I'm glad you're finally here. So please thrill us with your brilliance.
Well, it definitely took a village this time, Fred, but hopefully you'll invite me back and there'll be more of an orderly process. And I was able to, I think, hear everything except when we were frantically pushing buttons here, and strongly echo the sentiments that have been voiced. Just a couple quick points. And I'd also want to echo Ellie's thanks to AFPI for the gracious hospitality. You know, this is different, and what the line is going to be out of the regime is this isn't different. It's more of the same. It will peter out. They are inevitable and 100 feet high. None of those things are true. The protests in 2009 were a political abstraction. This is very personal with the murder of Mahsa. And even if you're a hardliner, the notion that it's acceptable to beat a young woman to death not because she's not wearing a hijab, because you don't like how it's angled. I mean, you have to be pretty far gone to think that that is justified. And so I think you have a much broader swath of the Iranian people who are very, very unhappy about this. And, you know, I think it's important to note that the Supreme Leader Khamenei has issued what you'd see as the kill switch, basically the okay to fire to the IRGC. So we'll see what they do in coming hours and days to try to tamper down the protests with really savage violence, to the point that they're going to blame the United States, and the administration is concerned about this. Well, they're going to blame us anyway, no matter what we do. They already have, and we haven't done anything. So, I mean, we just have to accept that that's their default mechanism. And so we are to blame, and we should take that as a badge of honor and do everything we can to encourage them. The main area I've been looking at for, sadly, 4 years now is the issue of getting unfettered internet access into the country. That is possible. It is unfortunately more complicated for Iran than just Starlink, which has worked in Ukraine because everyone up to and including the government is using it. Here you need a system that can evade government detection. So there is also a hardware component to it. This can be done, and I hope and pray the administration is doing it. It's going to be hard. But as I said, it can be done. It's exporting free speech, which is the brand of the United States. And it means that then we can hear the voices of these women of Iran, and they can hear our voices. And it will make it much harder for the regime to peddle lies about this. And then finally, and two quick points that have emerged in the last couple of weeks. There's been new polling that suggests since July, the American people have switched in their prioritization. And this is interestingly quite bipartisan and across all age demographics, from thinking the JCPOA is a good idea to prioritizing women's rights. That's a huge shift. And it's also taking place among Democrats. And so the protests have really captured the American public imagination. And finally, in terms of turning Tehran into a pariah, they've basically issued us an invitation when they started shipping advisors and drones into Ukraine to kill the brave Ukrainians who are fighting for their freedom from the tyrannical Russians, who happen, not surprisingly, to be friends of the Iranian regime. So this is in violation of any number of sanctionable activities, and it is the fastest way to bring together the international community to say this has to stop. The Iranians have no involvement in this fight. There's no way they should be spending treasure and potentially blood in Ukraine, of all places. And this is the fastest way to make them a pariah. So that's really what I wanted to add quickly, and happy to participate in any questions is helpful.
Well, I have two questions for you, one from me and one from Taffy Gold in Miami. Taffy's question concerns how the Europeans are dealing with what's going on in Iran, and she's specifically interested in whether the French are going to follow the Germans' lead. The Germans have been so critical of the Iranians that the German ambassador was recently summoned to the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be chewed out because the Iranians are accusing the Germans of interfering in Iranian affairs. So that's my first question for you, Victoria, and then the others can answer also. I also want to know whether you think that this administration is going to resume full throttle trying to get a nuclear deal once they're past the midterm election.
Well, going to Taffy's question first, I mean, I would like to see all our European allies taking a much stronger stand and withdrawing all their senior diplomats. There's no reason to give the regime that sort of veneer of legitimacy, especially if the Iranians have boots on the ground in Europe, which at least should be bad manners in diplomatic terms. So that would be step one. In terms of the French, they unfortunately are the most vested in terms of EU desire to get back in the JCPOA. So knowing President Macron a little bit, I'm sure his priority is to maintain his ability to talk to everyone. He will risk that last because he would like to be the statesman. He'd like to be the broker of some kind of deal in terms of getting back into the JCPOA. And if he alienates the Iranians too much over the uprising, he might lose that. And do you want me to answer the second question now, or do
yes,
you want?
I pose that to the other panelists. I had this view that the administration only paused their efforts to get a nuclear deal because of the midterms. I think they're going to go back full throttle to get an agreement once they're past the midterm. But maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Oh, 100%. And the polling I discussed is available on the website 1945.com in a piece I wrote last week. So if anyone wants to consult it, the shift in Democrat support for the protests over the JCPOA between July and October was night and day. And if I'm seeing those numbers, the administration is seeing those numbers. And I think when they saw that shift, particularly after Unga and Raisi, being given a visa and coming and giving that noxious speech, I think they realized what they thought was going to be their great diplomatic victory is actually a horrible political loser, and it got shelved until the midterm. So I think you're spot on that, on your reading of that.
Okay. Ellie and Jacob, what are your views on Taffy's question or other issues?
Well, I do want to echo what Victoria said about what the Europeans can do. And also, I just want to point out, I think Europe for too long perceived the Islamic Republic regime as the Middle East problem. You know, the Islamic Republic of Iran is Israel's problem. It's the Saudis' problem. It's the Emiratis' problem. It's not our problem. Well, you know, by selling their drone technology to Russia, by putting their boots on the ground in Crimea to train Russian forces in the use of these drones to help with maintenance, and so on, what the Islamic Republic proved to the Europeans is that, in fact, they are no longer just the Middle East problem. So, you know, really the Europeans need to wake up to that reality. And exactly like Victoria said, they should be recalling their ambassadors from the Islamic Republic, and they should be expelling the so-called diplomats of the Islamic Republic from European soil.
Thank you. Jacob?
Yep, just to echo what Ellie and Victoria said, and I was going to actually reference Victoria's piece in 1945. I thought that you know, split screen between the polling on human rights versus the nuclear deal, I think, was very illustrative, and I really learned a lot from that piece. I think, you know, I stressed earlier that Europe has kind of uncharacteristically, Germany in particular, taken steps, but those are symbolic steps. I mean, there's so much more that has to be done. I mean, that is basically, you know, Iranian assets are in Europe still. I mean, the European businesses are still making profits, and Iran is making profits as well from that exchange there. So it is just one step, and it's an important symbolic step, but I think much more needs to be done to push it in that direction. Ellie alluded as well to protests around the world taking place. I mean, you look at Berlin and how vibrant and vocal protesters are in support of the women in Iran, and I think that the Germans cannot ignore that either. I mean, so I think, you know, as Victoria alluded, I mean, we'll wait to see what steps the IRGC, the Iranian government, will take next. But I think, you know, we should also anticipate a reaction as well from communities around Europe as well, and that certainly will help drive policy there, hopefully, as well. So, yeah, that's my thought.
My view is that there are many drivers behind these protests in Iran right now. There's the oppression of women and the attempt by this brutal theocratic regime to keep them down. This is a dictatorship. There's a young population that is yearning for freedom and knows for freedom outside of the country. But there's also corruption, and there's also the economy. The economy is in bad shape, and one reason it's in bad shape is because there is still a substantial number of sanctions against Iran. Now, although the Biden administration lifted them, Donald Trump in place at least 1,000, I think over 1,000 sanctions on Iran. And I think it is incumbent that those sanctions remain, that more be in place. But I'm wondering what can be done to put even more sanctions on Iran, to get Europe to recognize that the best way to punish Iran, to stop it from getting access to technology for its missile and nuclear programs and terrorism, is to sanction it more, to reimpose maximum pressure. We know the administration doesn't like maximum pressure, but I don't see any other way to go.
Well, no, Fred, and I think you know, we will hopefully have an opportunity, if there are changes in Congress in November, to at least get a robust congressional debate about the kind of actions they can take. It is hard to impose sanctions from the Congress. I know, because I've tried to do it in the past, but it can be done. And at least Congress can send a very, very clear message that any international companies that do business with Iran under any sort of JCPOA, that they will be sanctioned by a future administration. And so, you know, money is a coward, and any company responsible either to its ownership or its shareholders should be extremely cautious about that, with the potential change coming then in a matter of months in 2025. And the other piece of that is looking at penalties should any president, it would obviously be President Biden, but any future president attempt to impose any diplomatic agreement via the United Nations Security Council as opposed to passing it through the United States Senate as a treaty, that there are going to be severe penalties out of the Congress, that this, whatever the agreement is, will be considered illegal and compliance with it will be prohibited. So you could go down that road as well. But I think arming a new Congress with ideas like this is going to be the fastest way to prevent a big influx of money into Iran. And then fuller sanctions would probably have to wait for another president.
Yeah, I think that's right. Ellie?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Victoria just said. And Fred, I guess, just to remind our audience that the Trump administration did wage the historically strongest sanctions campaign of any one country against the other, which was the maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic. And the reality is, and we saw statistics from the IMF at the end of the 4-year Trump administration term, that the Islamic Republic was really on the verge of bankruptcy. It was something like they had $3 billion left in accessible foreign currency reserves. So just goes to show what you're saying, Fred, and what Victoria, what you're saying, that our sanctions can be very effective.
Jacob?
Yeah, I agree with everything Victoria and Ellie just said. I think sanctions, secondary sanctions in particular, not just on individuals, but which is being done right now, but I think on entities, on state entities is critical. I think, on China getting at their purchasing of Iranian oil, I mean, that's something that's, has to be looked at as well. But I think it all goes back to a point I and Ellie both mentioned earlier. I mean, looking at Iran as the adversary that it is and coming up with a policy framework, really, resuscitating the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy approach that sees Iran as an adversary, that sees all of its activities as connected to the ideology of the regime and the agenda of the regime, and really only lifting that until all those 12 demands are met. And so I think that really is the way to go. But as Victoria said, probably a different administration.
Well, with this group of special guests, I can't not ask a question about the Abraham Accords, the historic agreement that the Trump administration negotiated that normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states and made it clear that their enemy is Iran. It's not Israel. And they have so much to gain by normalizing relations with Israel. And we've seen that going on. I just want each of you to talk about the Abraham Accords briefly, since we're running out of time. And what role will that play in promoting stability in the Middle East and isolating Iran at this vital time? Victoria, let's start with you.
Well, thanks, Fred. And I think they can play an extraordinary role, because security coordination that would have been impossible between our Gulf partners and allies and Israel is now very possible. And of course, they're all now in CENTCOM, which makes that another way, if the United States imposes or exercises rather strong leadership, we can help them do that coordination. And I would just add another topic that Ellie and I have worked on with our colleague Len Kordakovsky, which is the enemy of the Israelis and the Gulf states is not the Iranian people, it is the regime in Tehran. And the Iranian people should know that what we might call the Cyrus Accords are on offer from the rest of the world if they would like to make peace with Israel under U.S. leadership, at which point all sorts of things and a much more hopeful future are possible for them and for us.
Jacob, I'm going to go to you, then I'm going to have Ellie close out.
Sure. I think Victoria put it very eloquently. I think that's exactly right. I underscore as well your point that this is about the Iranian regime specifically, targeting them. It is not against the Iranian people. And that's a distinction I make in my writing as well. And I think the Abraham Accords proved, and they were about peace and prosperity and doing away with old and failed ideologies that don't work, and really bringing other nations to realize that the main impediment to peace in the region is Iran. I mean, it's destabilizing activities, it's sponsorship of terrorism and proxies. All of that has made the region and makes the region much more fragile and vulnerable. And so Victoria mentioned the inclusion of Israel and CENTCOM, the first publicly acknowledged joint naval operations exercises between Israel, Bahrain, and the signatory nations. And all of that represents a sea change in how policy in the Middle East will take place.
Thank you. Ellie?
Specifically regarding the Abraham Accords, the one additional thought I will add to it is that it's led to a change of narrative in the region. So whereas in the past we saw a lot of the Arab and Muslim countries scapegoat Israel and scapegoat their problems, their internal domestic problems on Israel and the Jews, we're seeing a sea change in the narrative. I am seeing so many Arab Zionists come out to support Israel, even in moments of crisis and war between Israel and Hamas. And so, and to me, that has been the most profound change to watch. I really feel like it's been like a reunion of cousins who were separated by forces of history and were coming back together again. And so, Fred, also, if you're asking me to close out, I want to remind everyone again that America First Policy Institute held this conversation today about the voices of women in Iran. And so I really want my sisters in Iran to know that there are so many of us, millions and millions in America, in the West, all over the world, who stand by you, we're with you, and we know that you're going to be victorious.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria Kota, Ellie Kahanam, Jacob Oldort, for participating in this very informative discussion. I'd like to thank our viewers for watching. We'll be posting a video of this on our website, americafirstpolicy.com, a little later today. This is the first of several videos that AFPI will, Zoom videos that AFPI will be producing over the next few months. I think the next one is going to be on North Korea. I fear North Korea could test a nuclear device soon, possibly before the election. Keep an eye out for our next webinar on that. I hope you can join us, and please check out our website to learn all about the America First Policy Institute, americafirstpolicy.com, and I hope to see you again soon.